The Matthew chapter 24 Paradox, Part 1. With Part 1 of the Matthew chapter 24 Paradox, I will begin a lengthy study in the correct understanding of what I believe the most mysterious chapter in end-time prophecy in the New Testament. Matthew chapter 24 is among the best sources of Bible end-time prophecy, but it is also among the most mysterious in the Bible. This chapter, though speaking of an unspecified final generation that would witness the second coming of Jesus Christ, speaks of events that in part have fulfilled themselves in the 1st century AD, and since then continue to fulfill themselves. In fact, there has not been a single generation in church history where many of the events as signs have fulfilled themselves repeatedly in every generation up to this present time and generation. Matthew chapter 24, final generation that would witness the second coming of Jesus Christ, appears to be a generation where almost every sign in this chapter has fulfilled itself, but with the exception that there was no second coming of Jesus Christ. Is Matthew chapter 24 an unspecified future generation that will fulfill itself from beginning to end? Or is it any past or present generation that did not fulfill itself and would fulfill itself in some future generation because of some restraining power that has been all this time from when Jesus Christ began his preachings to this present time, restraining that this generation, as described in Matthew chapter 24, fulfills itself with the second coming of Jesus Christ, and reason why I call it the Matthew chapter 24 paradox. A generation that appears to have fulfilled itself in the 1st century AD, but with no second coming of Jesus Christ, and with signs of his coming that could be found in every past generation, leaving many historians to believe that Matthew chapter 24 is a confusing chapter in timings and fulfillment of events, or that it is a failed prophecy, or at least in part, or simply impossible to fully interpret, or even that this generation that would witness the second coming is not to be understood in length of years as that of how one counts a generation time, but more as a time or an age that stretches from when Jesus began his preachings, death, and resurrection until his second coming. This is reason why we see many of the events of Matthew chapter 24 fulfilled, and not just in our generation, but that of the 1st century AD, and then repeatedly some of the events as signs of the second coming of Jesus Christ in practically every generation, including ours. But then are historians men of faith? Or is it that such men, by being intellectuals and not always men of faith in God, are not understanding Christianity and is relating with God, and reason why there is so much confusion with the understanding of this chapter? Colossians chapter 2 KJV verse 8. Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. In Matthew chapter 24, there are events as signs that were both fulfilled in that 1st generation AD, and events as signs that have repeatedly fulfilled themselves over and over in every generation, and other events as signs not fulfilled and after 2,000 years have still to fulfill themselves. I believe to have found how to understand Matthew chapter 24, having it completely explained as a single generation, where all events fulfill themselves in the course of a generation time, and most probably referring to our generation, and at the same time, without denying that part of it did fulfill itself in the first generation AD. But then something restrained the full fulfillment of all events in that chapter, and at the same time, the whole chapter, from beginning to end, is in the progress of fulfilling itself in this present generation. To understand Matthew chapter 24 in revealing what and when is this generation that Jesus speaks about is also to answer two basic questions. Question 1. Or Matthew chapter 24 is a generation that repeatedly repeats itself in every generation time since Jesus Christ began his preachings, but at the same time a generation that never comes to full fulfillment of itself. Or a generation that is future to every generation since Jesus Christ began his preachings and stands alone as that final generation by which there is no other in church history from its beginning to end. The study will be divided in many parts and will have the whole of Matthew chapter 24 revealed in a way that I believe never revealed by anyone before. Thank you.